welcome to the David Icke Videocast this Christmas New Year week. Hope you've had a nice break. But the world moves on, and I'm going to go through the week's news and happenings and look at it in a different context from that which you'll get in the mainstream media. And I'm going to start with the United States because some of us have been saying for a long, long time that the image presented by the United States to the world, by the regime in Washington, be it Democrat or Republican at the time, is a massive inversion of what is the truth. We are presented with the propaganda that the United States regime is the home and the bastion of Western values, that they want to bring peace to the world, and basically they're the good guys just trying to make the world a better place. Well, basically invert that and you'll get somewhere near the truth. The United States was created from the start by forces out of Europe that were planning to and have since used the US as a vehicle to impose their will upon the world, politically, financially, and militarily. It's nothing to do with, and never has been anything to do with, what is best for the people of America. They are an irrelevance to this force. And therefore, when you look at American domestic policy, it's not for the benefit of American people, apart from the very few extremely rich people who are beneficiaries and indeed connected to this network. The ones that run the corporations, that run the banks, that run the government, they are the ones that benefit from the US regime. Most of everyone else is there simply as a front for this network to hide behind. For instance, it was catastrophic for Americans for the vast outsourcing of jobs from the land of America to other countries like Mexico and the Far East, where outrageous, appalling sweatshops have been employed, China too, to produce goods at very, very knocked down prices, using labor that is nothing less than slavery, and then selling those cheaply made products because of the slavery to Western countries, including the United States, at the highest price that they could get. So the American people have lost jobs, while people in other countries have been grotesquely exploited. And the common theme is that both have happened because of corporations controlled by the 1% or less than 1%, the same people that control the United States government and its policies, financial, militarily, and in every other way. And the United States, therefore, is not the home of freedom, not the home of the pursuit of peace and values. It is a global bully, which is intent on imposing the will of its hidden masters on the rest of the world. And they have done this through financial means and through military means. If you put words into a search engine along the lines of United States wars since 1776, you'll see the extraordinary number of wars that the US has been involved in from the moment virtually of its creation. And these are wars of conquest and wars of removing regimes in other countries and governments and leaders in other countries who will not do what the United States tells them to do, and it's still going on. So, what we've seen in the last few days in the pronouncements and the threats coming from the UN ambassador for the United States, Nikki Haley, is merely bringing into the public arena what has been done in the shadows all along. Nikki Haley, this vacuous lady who talks to people and reads her script like some narcissistic, overbearing head teacher talking to 5 or 6 year olds, she has been threatening countries with consequences and financial reprisals for voting against the United States in the UN General Assembly and its decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Any country that truly believed in democracy, and it's the last thing any regime in Washington has ever done, would say, well, we don't agree with you, but 128 countries have voted against our decision over Jerusalem. Only 9 have voted with us, and they were under threat from the United States of consequences. So maybe we should look at this again, because clearly we're going against the will of what is called the international community, or the global opinion. But no, instead of accepting a democratic vote, they have to start threatening consequences, with the said vacuous Nikki Haley warning that their names will be taken down, those that voted against the United States. I mean, that is classic head teacher saying, any naughty boys and girls, I'll write their names down and you'll face consequences, you'll have detention. I mean, it's pathetic. And the whole promoted propaganda persona of United States governments is so utterly inverted and on its head. Throughout the history of the country, not only have there been constant wars of acquisition, wars of removing governments and leaders they don't want and don't like. We've had the manipulation of coups in countries again and again and again through organizations like the CIA to remove governments and leaders that will not dance to America's tune. We've seen the creation of terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, who are used as a enemy, a manufactured enemy, to justify the invasion of countries and the removal of, again, leaders and governments they don't want. And so we've seen the process in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria. The Russians threw a spanner into that works. We're seeing now the demonization of Iran and the focus on North Korea. All of these countries are on a list of countries listed for regime change from an organization called the Project for the New American Century in a document published in September 2000. And that same group that was behind that organization are still driving the policy of the Trump regime to this day, as they drove the policy of the Obama regime and the Bush regime before him. This is why this list of countries, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran, North Korea, Lebanon was on the list as well, so was China, have been so targeted either through direct military means, through the manipulation of civil wars instigated by groups controlled by the United States, throw Britain in there as well, and or verbally up to this point in the terms of Iran and North Korea. It's because that is the list for regime change plus others of this hidden network that created the United States and has controlled it ever since. And thus, no matter what party is officially in power, Democrat or Republican, that list goes on being ticked off. Now, the same applies to the financial policies of the United States and the diplomatic policies. They are not the policies to benefit the people of the United States. They are the policies of this hidden network that is using the United States as its personal fiefdom to impose its will on the world. Same with Britain and other countries in Europe, including Germany. And so when you look at the American military, it's not the American military. It's the military of this network that controls the US government, thus controls the US military. The same network that owns and controls the armaments companies that make billions and billions and billions every year, selling weapons to the Pentagon and other countries around the world to kill and maim unspeakable numbers of people in pursuit of the agenda of that network that controls the armament companies. This is the truth of what's going on. And it's good in a way that the vacuous Nikki Haley and the vacuous Donald Trump have brought this hidden control and manipulation to the surface with their threats against those that refuse to bend the knee and do whatever they're told. I mean, we had excuse me, this extraordinary example this week of Guatemala. Guatemala came out and recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel in line with the American policy. The background is that Guatemala is the biggest recipient of American so-called aid in Central America. And it had the bare-faced cheek and nerve to say that this decision to recognize Jerusalem had nothing to do with the money handed over by the United States every year. Of course, Guatemala is in terms of its government, deeply corrupt and just a fiefdom of the United States. And this is how this Washington regime works. It dictates to other countries, and if they don't play ball, then there are military or financial consequences. And one of the ways that America claims to be so kind and generous in terms of its government is the aid that it gives to countries, in this case Guatemala. But it's not aid at all. It's buying subservience. It's buying control. And anyway, vast amounts of this so-called generously given aid, because we're lovely, we are, is handed over with strings attached, which means that the money has to be spent with American corporations. So basically, this US aid, or great amounts of it, are nothing more than a scam to transfer money from the American people via the American government to American corporations while calling it aid to developing countries. And of course, so many of these developing countries over the years have had dictators in charge, placed there by the United States to do the will of the United States and throw Britain in as well, because they're just as bloody bad in the whole area of manipulation I'm talking about. And these dictators, tyrants, mass murderers often, have been doing the will of the United States and becoming very rich as a result of that. And so this is the truth about how it all works. And the United Nations is not there to represent the interests of the people of the world. It was created by the United States through families like the Rockefellers to be a vehicle for the United States to centrally dictate to the world and also to eventually evolve the UN into a fully fledged world government that would dictate to every country, even every community on the planet. And the Rockefeller family, which, along with others, most notably the Rothschilds, are among this hidden group which direct a policy through the people that we see, politicians and bankers and what have you. And the Rockefeller family gave the land, imagine what that would be worth, on which the UN building stands to this day in New York. It gave that land for free and was a major manipulator in the creation of the United Nations. So you have the United States regime and its hidden hand creating the UN. They give the land for free, and it's based in New York, and it's been the fiefdom of the US. The only mitigating kind of block on its power has been the veto possibilities in the UN Security Council through countries like Russia and China. But of course, the veto, to veto votes decided by the UN Security Council massively benefits the United States, because anything they don't like that is not good for the United States, they can veto. And also, what's not good for Israel in terms of condemnation of the behavior of the regimes in Israel. And so we come to this other level of what is happening at the moment and what is being revealed by the actions of the United States. And that is the control of the Washington regime, not least of Donald Trump, by Israel and networks of Israel in the United States. And for Israel, read the House of Rothschild, which basically created Israel and controls it to this day. And so when you look at the people around Trump, in many, many areas, but let's look at the people immediately around Trump in relation to Israel policy and the decision over Jerusalem, and you find that his chief advisor is his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who is a lifelong friend of Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu, when he went to Washington to meet Donald Trump after he was elected, said at a news conference that he has slept in the childhood bed of Jared Kushner because Netanyahu is a close friend of Kushner's father, who has done jail time for fraud. And so Jared Kushner and Benjamin Netanyahu are as one on the policy of the United States with regard to Israel. Then you look at David Friedman, who is a long-time associate of Donald Trump before he went into politics. David Friedman was appointed by Trump as the United States ambassador to Israel. This man is an ultra-extreme Zionist. And then you look at another long-time Trump associate, Jason Greenblatt, who was appointed as the chief international negotiator by Trump. And that negotiation includes the negotiations for in quotes, because they're not really, between Israel and the Palestinians. So the whole US policy with regard to Israel, even in that group of people, small group of people, is completely stitched up. And that's where the whole thing came about in relation to the recognition of the capital of Israel as Jerusalem. And so when you look at the response to the rejection of that by the UN General Assembly, 128 countries, and the threats, you've also got to put into the mix where those threats are coming from, which is not only from Washington, but from Israel through Washington. And for Israel, read the House of Rothschild. We've even had a story in the last few days that the State Department in the United States has reportedly rejected a request by this David Friedman, the US ambassador to Israel, to stop referring to Israel's control of the West Bank as occupation, which it absolutely is. It's illegal occupation under international law. And this report says that the State Department officials have rejected it, but the final decision will be ultimately taken by Donald Trump. And so it will be interesting to see how that turns out when it gets to his desk. And we have seen, as a result of this ultra-Zionist Israel control of the Trump regime, the way that from the moment that Trump was elected, Netanyahu and his regime in Israel has been pursuing even more vehemently this complete takeover of Palestinian land, occupied land, with more and more settlements and other actions which have basically said, we know now, with Trump in the White House, that we can do whatever we like. And so we have this ridiculous charade, this ludicrous propaganda that says the United States is the good guy of the world, the John Wayne, the good, fair, tough guy who's putting right wrongs, when the United States regime is just a vehicle for a psychopathic hidden network that puts psychopathic people in power to do psychopathic things. And of course, for me anyway, few personify that psychopathic mentality more than the Secretary of State for so-called defense, the Secretary of State for attack at the Pentagon, James Mattis, who is known as Mad Dog, and quite rightly from his behavior in the military. And so Mad Dog is now talking about, or talking to American troops, saying they have to be ready for war in relation to what is happening in the Korean Peninsula, which is on the list of countries that the US and its hidden masses want to regime change. And, you know, more and more, which is very, very good thing, more and more the truth about the United States regimes, whatever party's in power, is coming to light and being more spoken about. And we've had help, like I say, from the pronouncements of Nikki Haley. We've had also the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, openly talking about the use of terrorists by the United States to bring about regime change, which some of us have been writing about for a very, very long time, decades and decades. The way that the United States is behind these terrorist groups, which it uses as a covert proxy army to remove leaders and regimes that won't play ball. Because if you continually invade countries with your military openly, as with the invasion of Iraq, etc., then people are going to look up from the game show and the movie, and they're going to say, "What's going on? The United States invading everybody." So you use proxy armies called freedom fighters, and we have seen this happen in Libya. We've seen it happen in Syria and elsewhere. And Lavrov has said this week about, or talked this week about attempts to profit from anti-terrorist objectives, which should be common, unified, and without double standards. And he calls this disturbing. He said that these objectives to stop terrorism should not be used to promote one's own agenda, including changing unwanted regimes. But that's exactly what the United States has been doing decade after decade after decade, not just in the Middle East, but in South America, Central America, and elsewhere. And Lavrov said that Rex Tillerson, he's the Secretary of State in the United States, he said, Rex Tillerson used to tell me that the main goal of the US in Syria is defeating ISIS, but now it is getting vaguer and vaguer. Well, of course it is, because that was never the idea. The idea was to create ISIS, and ISIS would overrun the Assad government in Damascus and take over Syria. And before Russia came in on the side of the Syrian government, that's exactly what was happening. All those bombs being dropped, all those American forces in Syria to stop ISIS, but they weren't doing that because they weren't there to do that. And only when Russia came in was the ISIS army driven back and eventually driven out virtually. Without the Russians coming in and Vladimir Putin, then there would be no Assad and there would be no Syria government. There would be ISIS control of Syria on behalf of the United States. So we are seeing coming to the surface now the truth about America and its regime, and the way that it is not there for the people of the United States, or indeed the people of the world. It's there to promote, advance, and impose the will of a tiny cabal which created the United States as we know it and has controlled it ever since. Okay, let's move on.